Initially, the complaints came from nature groups, conservation workers, and wildlife researchers, whining about their trail cams. They'd come from the university in the city where they had big grants and complex equipment but didn't have the space or woodland to test it or put it to use. The only wildlife they were likely to find in the city, barring the locals, was a few pigeons and the occasional rat, which wasn't exactly what these folks had in mind for the field study. The upshot was these researchers all tended to file out of the city, petitioning the local council for permits and permissions to set up cameras in Acres Woods, on the moor and the hills around Moorton, hoping to catch glimpses of our local wildlife. What exactly they were hoping to catch on film was never made clear. As far as I knew, the biggest thing we were likely to see in those woods was a badger or maybe a fox. I had heard rumors of deer in the area, but having lived in Moorton for 20 years and never seen one, I considered them to be something of a fairy tale. The complaints came into the police station and to council offices about a month after the cameras had initially been set up in Acres Woods. I was actually in the station and on shift the day that one of the researchers, a natty-haired woman in a woolen cardigan that made her look like she'd come out for the day dressed as a sofa, came screaming and bawling into the offices, screeching about grant funds and deliberate sabotage by the Moorton locals. When I explained that most of the people in Moorton didn't know what these researchers were doing and that they probably didn't care, she only became more furious, repeating over and over that something had to be done. She positively insisted that these hideous criminals be apprehended immediately and without delay. Safe to say, I leapt straight into action with all the speed and urgency that a global emergency on this scale actually warranted, scheduling a meeting with her and her team for the following morning and returning to my usual load of casework. Sure enough, bright and early the following morning, the woman still wearing the woolen cardigan that looked as if it was slowly consuming her was banging on the glass door of the station before we even opened. An hour later, she was sitting in the interview room with an ancient television set up to show me the footage of the criminal in action. On the table between us was the camera itself, with the glass lens completely covered over with black spray paint. The footage I sat through was shot with a night vision camera, and admittedly, as soon as I saw the footage flash up on the screen, I did get a sense of why my naturalist friend was so upset. A night vision camera is an expensive bit of kit to have damaged by some idiot who doesn't like you filming. I sat patiently for a few minutes, trying not to yawn as I watched what appeared to be fascinating action shots of plants moving slightly in the breeze. The footage was all murky, half-lit greens and blacks, as if the whole place was radioactive or made of the same stuff that kids' glow-in-the-dark toys are. The shot was initially just a clearing, a few large oak trees in the background, some leafy scrub peeking into the shot. I remember feeling sorry for the poor researchers who had to sit through hours of this stuff hoping to catch a glimpse of a deer or a fox in its natural habitat, when the Moorton foxes were far more likely to be picking through the bins down at the local takeaway. Riveting as this is, I remember saying, could we maybe skip to the relevant section? Puffing out her cheeks in aspiration as if I'd asked her to tape over the birth of her first child, the victim, as she insisted on calling herself, fast-forwarded the footage to a point about 9 minutes in, making me eternally glad that I'd asked to skip on a little. At around the 9-minute mark, a figure, presumably from the build, a young man, in a hooded top emerged from the bushes. He had on a black mask of some sort, pulled over his face to stop him being identified. The mask itself, which must have been skin tight because even the contours of the face were not visible, did make for an eerie effect. Whenever the culprit turned to face the camera, it appeared as if the hood he was wearing was entirely hollow, with only a blank space held beneath it. After a few seconds looking around and clearly trying to find the camera, the perp calmly walked over to it, took a can of spray paint from his bag and sprayed the entire surface of the lens black, meaning that any further footage by those cameras was entirely useless. I stared at the blank screens and then back at the woman. I thanked her for her time and asked her if we could keep the footage and told her that we would follow up on any and all leads in an attempt to catch the culprit. Knowing full well that with such grainy footage and such an effective disguise, it was unlikely we were going to apprehend anyone, not to mention the fact that this kind of stupid prank wasn't exactly a priority. Of course, the researcher continued to howl at me, complaining that not enough was being done and that this wicked villain needed to be stopped before he struck again. It was when she suggested we dust for prints that I finally lost my patience. Dust for prints? In the woods? Yes, there must be DNA or something that you can use to track him down, she screamed. I think goodbye, we'll be in touch, was as polite a response as I could muster. Over the next week, we got another 6 calls from students and researchers saying that their cameras had been destroyed, either painted over or taped with electrical tape over the lens. By this point, we were beginning to see that this wasn't just a random idiot with an axe to grind, but more of a focused assault against the wood dwellers. Or so we thought, until the next day when 14 separate cameras, all situated in the town center of Moorton, were damaged in a matter of minutes. The woods, it seems, had either been a practice or a place where preparations were taking place. Looking back at the footage in the moments before the screens went blank, we saw a clear repeat of the earlier incidents outside of town. The same hooded figure, the same blanked-out face. What was strikingly different this time, however, was that in some shots, several figures could be seen. As one sprayed a lens over the town hall, another could be seen crossing the square toward the station, whilst yet another emerged from beside the Dolphin Hotel. Within the space of 10 minutes, every mounted camera around the town square had been put out of action. For a space of around a quarter of a mile and for over an hour whilst we sought to repair them, the police department of Moorton was without cameras and effectively blind. On that occasion, nothing was damaged or taken. This again was a practice run. The following morning, I requested extra men from the city. My idea was to deploy these extra men during the early hours of the morning and apprehend the guilty parties in a surprise clampdown. Of course, that never happened. We had the extra manpower, but there was not a soul on the streets around the city center. On the night in question, the perpetrators were busy elsewhere. When the calls first came in about lines outside people's houses, I'll admit I was a little confused as to exactly what they were talking about. Eventually, it became clear that in the night, someone had gone out and, using the same species of roller that one would use to paint markings onto roads, had taken it upon themselves to draw straight white lines directly outside people's property, sometimes on the pavement, sometimes on the road, and sometimes cutting directly across people's lawns, gardens, and paving stones. As the morning went on, more and more calls came in. Eventually, noticing that a few of the complainants seemed to have come in a cluster, one of my more tech-savvy colleagues sent up a mounted drone to show just how far the lines across Moorton actually extended. It was only as we watched the footage being fed back to us that we realized it was not a line across Moorton, but around it. From the camera's images, it was clear that someone, or more likely a group of someones, had taken the time in the middle of the night to paint a huge circle around the perimeter of the town, almost exactly matching the border charts for the town on council maps. The line, which seemed to be single and unbroken, wrapped like the loop of a lasso around the town and extended literally for miles, skirting the outsides of Acre Woods, stopping just before the Marston estate and scooping back around to the foot of the trail up to the hills. To complete the job in one night would have taken many hours and at least a score or more people working at the same time. Why they would want to do it in the first place was a mystery, though now it seems likely that the whole thing was intended as some kind of marker or barrier. For the next few weeks, very little in the way of strange vandalism occurred. Then, in the early hours of Sunday morning, the whole of Moorton's CCTV network went blind. Whilst the streetlights remained and electricity was unaffected, every CCTV camera within perimeter of the line marked around the town was affected. The perpetrators, clearly working as some kind of gang, used a variety of tactics, from spray painting the lens as they had done before, to opening up umbrellas and taping them in place in front of the camera so that it completely blocked the camera's view. By our most conservative estimates, there must have been at least 40 to 60 people working on the project in a coordinated attack which blocked the vision for almost the entire town, including the area up to Acre Woods. 40 to 60 individuals, all with the same hoods and the same black masks that seemed to remove their faces entirely. Despite having called for extra men a few weeks earlier, That night we were caught completely off guard. Only one officer was tasked with monitoring the city cameras that night, and since nothing ever happened in Moorton in the early hours of a Sunday morning, he had slept through the majority of his shift, as he did most nights, only calling to inform me that the cameras were offline the following morning, by which time they had been off for most of the night. As it turned out, even that information was inaccurate. The cameras were not offline. They simply had their vision capacity impaired. When reports began flooding in that morning of blood, splattered all over people's doorways, gardens, and fences, of bright red pools of viscera dragged in trails up the middle of the roads and dripping all along the paths, we decided to recover the tapes even without the visuals and play them back in the hope that perhaps one of the cameras might have caught a glimpse, giving us some hope of finding the culprits. As expected, in the moments before, we saw the hooded figures all approaching the lenses just before the images shut out. What we hadn't expected, and what came as a hideous surprise, was for the audio on some of the cameras to still be working. Within seconds, it became clear that although we couldn't see anything, we could still certainly hear. It also became clear that what we had thought of as an act of vandalism or an elaborate prank, leaving blood trails around the street towns, was actually something far worse than we thought. The perpetrators had not arrived with the blood prepared for scattering, but rather, for their own sick purposes, had collected it there and then, slaughtering and butchering the animals in the dead center of Moorton Town Square before setting off to spread their blood and entrails across the town in some kind of marking ceremony, a ceremony unseen by the cameras, but not unheard. Why they chose to mark out Moorton to complete the process in our town center, we will never know. What I do know is that the audio of the mass killing, be it a prank, a ritual, or some kind of sacrifice, will stay with me for the rest of my days. The sounds of lambs and goats bleeding and crying in desperate terror before their throats were slit was hard to stomach. For almost an hour, we listened to screams layered one atop the other, emerging from footage that showed not the tiniest glimpse of light, but only a sheet of impenetrable, hopeless black. By the time we realized what had been done, most of the town's residents had been out and scrubbed away the animal blood. What hadn't been removed by soap and elbow grease had been washed away in the rain. Something which to this day I consider to be a tragedy, because I'm convinced that somewhere within those trails of blood, stretching so far and yet so easily removed, there was evidence. Blood mixed up in animal viscera which came not from a goat, but from a human victim. The owner of the voice, which behind the bleating of goats, we had all of us heard, was screaming.